Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IEA. Welcome to our headquarters here. This is somewhat new for us to do a press conference in Paris, so we're delighted to have you all here. We are here for, obviously, the launch of the World Energy Outlook. We had very satisfied with the launch this morning. You've probably seen stories you've written or your colleagues have written. We want to give you more details this morning, obviously give you an opportunity to talk with our executive director. So we'll have a 30 to 40-minute presentation to kind of run you through the highlights of the report. It will be given by Dr. Birol, our executive director, and Laura Coetzee and Tim Gould, who are the co-lead authors of the WEO. And then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We started just a little bit late, but we hope to wrap this whole within an hour. So thank you very much again. And Dr. Birol, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jet, and good morning, dear colleagues, and good afternoon to the colleagues. I understood several people in Asia are also following this event. We have our World Energy Outlook, the world's flagship energy publication, launching today. And I thought I should give you a bit of a context where we are today in terms of energy, climate, and other issues. And my colleagues, Mr. Gould and Mrs. Coetzee, will take you through some of the findings of the report. Now, when I look at the world today, the energy world, this is our job at the IEA, to look at the entire energy world as the world's energy authority. I see that today's energy world is defined by deep disparities. And I wanted to share with you three of them, which are critical. The first one is on the oil markets. Oil prices are averaging about $60 almost throughout this year, more or less stable, plus minus, despite some of the major producing and exporting countries are trying to manage the markets and their output, plus Iran, a major exporter, export went from 2.8 million barrels per day to almost 0.3 today. Venezuela, beginning of the year, 1.2 million barrels per day, today collapsing to 0.6 million barrels per day. Attack on Saudi Arabia, unrest in Iraq, and the prices are still around $60. This is, in my view, a major, major disparity, especially when you look at the history of oil, what happened in the past, and many of you know as much as I do. This is one issue. The second issue I wanted to bring to your attention is on the climate change front. There is a huge body of scientists around the world calling for immediate and deep cut in global emissions. Many governments are taking decisions, making programs, setting targets to cut the emissions, one after another. But on the other hand, again the disparity here, our numbers show that in the year 2018, last year, global emissions reached a historical high, just the opposite. Energy efficiency, which is perhaps one of the most powerful tools to reduce the emissions. Global energy efficiency improvement last year was one of the lowest in the history. The lowest in the last 10 years and one of the lowest in the history. When you look at the newspapers as good news about the emissions, climate change, we read a lot about electric cars. in this country, in France, where we live, or in Netherlands, in Norway, in several countries, in the United States and elsewhere, and China, of course. But ladies and gentlemen, our report shows that the star of the transformation in the automotive industry was not electric cars, it was the SUVs. SUVs, according to our numbers, they were just the second biggest reason of the global emissions growth in the last 10 years following the power sector, and much more than all the industry sectors put together. Iron, steel, petrochemical, fertilizer, all of them, more than all of them, the growth from SUVs, the emissions. Much higher than aviation sector. So in the year 2010, only 18% of all the cars sold were SUVs, and last year 42% of the cars sold were SUVs, with huge emission contribution. And this is not only in the United States, this is in China, India, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere. So we see this disparity as well. On one hand, the scientific evidence, government statements, on the other hand, what is happening in the real markets, in the real life, which is very important for the International Energy Agency. The third one, and the last one I wanted to bring to your attention, is that the United Nations and all international bodies, including ourselves, asking for a very important reality, namely modern energy for all in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. And despite this ask, despite this demand, despite the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as of today, 850 million people in the world, they have no access to electricity. As dramatic as it is, 2.6 billion people rely on agricultural waste, animal waste, and wood for cooking, which is a very big problem for women and children, especially. Now, we are seeing good news, cost reductions in many parts of the power sector and others. My colleagues will tell you, we have one very good news on the solar PV, growing very strongly and making a big contribution to the global electricity generation. Again, offshore wind, we have high expectations. Battery storage, high expectations. But the cost reductions here will not happen by themselves. There is a need, we believe, government support, a growing role of public sector playing a role to bring the cost down of these critical technologies. And here comes the IEA and our flagship publication, World Energy Outlook. We believe in the context of all these pressures on the energy security, on climate change, economic growth, and the challenges we are facing in terms of climate change and others, the critical decisions that will be made by the governments will be having long-lasting implications for the welfare of their citizens, for the health of our climate, and also the future of energy technology development. And it is the reason in this World Energy Outlook we have looked at what options we can give the policymakers, governments, industries, investors, that they can make the right choices for themselves and hopefully for our planet. Now, what are those scenarios? I will now pass the microphone to my colleague, Mr. Gould, to take us through.
Thank you very much, Executive Director, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. The Executive Director has referred to options, choices, and what we do in the World Energy Outlook is we illustrate those options and choices by using different scenarios. None of these scenarios are preordained. All of them are possible. And so we don't include a forecast of what will happen, but we do look at different variants, different pathways that the energy system could follow. And the first of these is what would happen if we continue on our current pathway with no additional policies from those in place today. We also look at what the future could hold if we bring in today's policy intentions and targets. That is called the stated policy scenario. It's been renamed in this year's outlook to underline that it only includes those policy initiatives that have already been announced. Those can cover a wide range. They could be targets for efficiency, they could be targets for renewables, they could be ambitions to extend full electrification to a country's population. And as ever, we look in detail at how, and to what extent the pathway to realize those goals is really clear in a national sort of policy framework. The scenario is very dynamic in terms of technology costs and technology learning, but we do limit ourselves to policies that have been announced. We don't try and second guess how those policy preferences might evolve in future. So our aim is to really hold up a mirror to the plans of today's policymakers and illustrate the consequences. Finally, we analyze what it would take to meet in full the long-term objectives that governments have set for themselves. This is the Sustainable Development Scenario. This means meeting in full international climate targets, including, of course, the Paris Agreement, as well as ensuring full access to electricity and clean cooking, and a dramatic reduction in the pollutants that cause poor air quality. This scenario has been updated and extended this year out to 2050. The extension doesn't offer new insights on the energy access side because that is achieved already by 2030. But it does offer new information on how the reduction in pollutants brings down the number of premature deaths due to air quality. And it gives considerable additional clarity on how the scenario meets international climate goals. We'll be talking about our projections, the future in this presentation, but sometimes in order to understand the future, it's worth looking back. And this is where we've started this time around. 100 years ago, 1919, the global energy system was dominated by two fuels, wood and coal. Coal had grown rapidly since the Industrial Revolution, but still around 30% of the world's energy needs were met by wood. Oil, largely produced in North America, was still very much at the start of its journey. By 1950, oil had taken a much more prominent role in the global energy mix. North America still accounts for more than half of global production, but harking back to what the executive director said a moment ago, the second largest producer in 1950 was Venezuela, at a level considerably higher than it is today. Early signs here too of the potential for natural gas as a source of heat for industry and buildings. Over the next couple of decades, oil use surged. By 1974, when the IEA itself was created, it had grown to just under half of all energy consumed. This was the era when the Middle East and Russia really increased their role as major sources of global oil supply, while as of 1970, it seemed that US oil and indeed gas production had peaked. The first oil crisis marked the high point for oil share in the global energy system. The picture in 2000 was already much more diversified. Late 1970s and 1980s saw the rise of nuclear power, led by the United States, also Japan and several European countries. Natural gas increased substantially as well, not least because of rising exports from the Soviet Union, and gas started to make inroads as a fuel for power generation as well. Moving to the present day, since 2000, two big stories. The rise of China as an economic powerhouse led to a resurgence in coal use. The share of coal in the global energy mix today is even slightly higher than it was in the year 2000. And the other major development that I'm sure you're all very well aware of is the rise of modern renewable sources of electricity, in particular solar PV, wind, with major contributions from Europe, from the United States, from China, India, and elsewhere. So what does this brief sweep through energy history tell us? For one thing, it shows that energy transitions between fuels, sometimes quite sharp ones, are possible and have been realized on multiple occasions over the last 100 years. But the complicating factor for a discussion of today's energy transitions is one of scale. 1919, global population was under 2 billion. Today, well over 7 billion. The global economy today is 20 times as large as it was 100 years ago. And we're using 10 times more energy than we did in 1919. The transitions that we've seen were essentially changes in the way that the world met its growing energy needs rather than reductions in the consumption of incumbent fuels. So the question we ask in the World Energy Outlook is, where do we go from here? As I mentioned, we don't have a single answer to that question, but what we aim to do is to provide a way to understand the choices, the challenges, and the historic responsibilities that we face today. One pathway that we'll talk about in detail over in this presentation would be to move towards a sustainable development scenario with, as the Executive Director has underlined, big contribution from energy efficiency and from a range of clean energy technologies. But we are not on track for that scenario. It's very clear when you look at current trends, and it's even clear when you look at the impact of today's policy announcements, so the stated policy scenario. In that scenario, an extra 25% to global energy demand by 2040. Another quite profound shift in the way that we meet that increase. So more than half of the increase in global energy demand is met by low carbon energy sources, first amongst them solar PV, and another third comes from natural gas, aided by increased trade in liquefied natural gas, LNG. And global energy-related emissions flatten, but they do not peak in this scenario. So for the moment, the momentum behind clean energy technologies and clean energy transitions is not enough to offset the effects of an expanding global economy and growing population. We'll come back to the implications of that a bit later. Looking back, one of the questions that you're left with is how quickly things can really change. There are different examples one could choose, but perhaps the clearest is US shale. 10 years ago, the idea that the US could become a net exporter of both oil and natural gas was almost unthinkable. Yet here we are, 10 years later, more than 1 trillion in upstream and midstream investment made in the meantime, and that is indeed where we are today, with the US already a net exporter of gas and on the cusp of becoming a net exporter of oil as well. The foundations were laid back in the 1970s after it became clear that the US conventional production had peaked. A publicly funded research and development effort that was followed by tax credits, market reforms, and partnerships that provided a platform for private initiative, innovation, cost reductions, and large-scale investment. Based on the latest available resource estimates, we project continued strong growth in US shale, even though the annual growth slows, and it stays higher for longer than in previous outlooks. And this has some quite profound implications for oil markets, trade, and geopolitics. Together with contributions from some other countries, it also acts as a strong counterweight for efforts to manage oil markets. The combined market share of OPEC countries and Russia, which was up at around 55% sometimes in the mid-2000s, goes down to well below 50% in the coming decades. Another important switch is taking place on the consumption side. Over the last 20 years, our data shows that consumers increased their consumption of oil faster than they increased their consumption of electricity. Why was that? Primarily because of personal mobility, increasing demand for diesel and gasoline. But the future doesn't look like the past. Electricity is at the heart of modern economies and lifestyles, and one of the few things that you can say with certainty about what will happen over the next couple of decades is that however fast energy demand increases, electricity demand will increase more quickly. And the engine of oil demand growth, passenger transport, is stalling due to improvements in fuel efficiency as well as fuel switching due to electric cars. So this is the picture when you look at the stated policy scenario to 2040, electricity consumption takes over, charges ahead because of demand from industrial consumers, particularly in the developing world, but also cooling for our homes and offices, likewise electrified heating in some cases, as well as electricity used for transport. And these trends, or this switch, is even more visible when you look at our sustainable development scenario. A word on natural gas, since this is another important growth story in the stated policy scenario. And the focus for our discussion here really switches across to Asia, which sees half of the projected growth in global gas demand. Where does this growth come from? Traditionally, you might expect that the largest source of growth for natural gas demand is in the power sector, but that's not the case in our projections for these large Asian emerging consumers of gas. It's in fact the industry sector, which is the predominant source of gas demand growth. That's as a feedstock for fertilizers, for methanol, but also for some lighter manufacturing sectors such as textiles, food processing, and so on. And then we switch to the supply side. A small share of that gas will be produced domestically in this scenario, notably in China, but the bulk of it is imported. Some of that, particularly in relation to China, comes via pipeline from Russia and an extra line from Central Asia. But most of the growth in imports comes from LNG. More than 400 billion cubic meters worth of new liquefaction facilities come online in the US, in Canada, in East Africa, in Russia, Qatar, much of it targeting Asian markets. And by 2040, the average gas molecule consumed in Asia has traveled more than 5,000 kilometers, nearly twice as far as it does today.
We now move on to a different part of the world. It's Africa. You don't often hear about Africa when you work on energy, but this is set to change, and to change very dramatically. And there is one very simple reason, is demographics. If you look today, Africa has a population that is smaller than that of China and India, but in the next couple of years, already by 2023, Africa will have overtaken China to become the largest region of the world, and by 2040 it will be a region with more than 2 billion people, more than 2 billion people. Put it very simply, it means that we are going to witness the largest urbanization that history has ever seen. We're going to be seeing 600 million people from now to 2040 being born or moving to cities in Africa. To give you a sense of the scale of how large that is, China, in the period of the big economic boom from the 1990s to 2010, moved to cities or had people born in cities that was half this scale. So it was 300 million people. Here we're talking about 600 million people. Of course, this will have implications for everything, economy, but also energy, obviously. If you look at oil, we're seeing Africa being the second largest growth market just after India. Why is that? There are a few reasons for this growth. First is transport. Today in Africa, 15 people out of 1,000 have a car, and these cars are pretty inefficient. The average efficiency of cars is what we were selling in Europe 15 years ago. It's half as efficient as what we have today. So there is a huge growth potential there. On the other hand, as the executive director mentioned earlier, most of the people in Africa today are cooking with very ancient types of fuels, wood. More and more people are going to rely on LPG because it's cleaner and it's safer for women to use. So today there are around 90 million people that are relying on LPG. We are seeing this growing to around 400 million. So those are the two main reasons why oil demand in Africa will grow and will have an impact on global trends. It doesn't stop to oil. We'll feel Africa presence in natural gas. We have felt it already. Over the past few years, 40% of the global gas discoveries were in Africa, Egypt, but also East and West Africa, Senegal, Tanzania, Mozambique, also South Africa offshore. And we are expecting this gas to be used domestically, also exported, but more and more used domestically. Why? Because all these cities need to be built. They will need cement, they will need steel, they will need electricity. So this gas is going to be more and more used domestically to feed this huge economic growth. And finally, on renewables, we see here a huge growth potential, but not yet materializing. Why? Because the executive director mentioned earlier, there are 850 million people globally not having access to electricity. This is predominantly in Africa. The situation is getting better, but by 2030, we are still expecting around 500,000 people, 500 million people not having access to electricity. To change this, the key lever is really renewables. I give you one example. Today, solar in Africa is 5 gigawatts. Installed solar capacity in Africa is 5 gigawatts. To give you an example, the Netherlands has 5 gigawatts. The solar potential of Africa is 40% of the world, and current installed capacity is only 1% of the global installed capacity. There is a huge upside potential, and we analyze this. In fact, in our case, in which everyone gets access, we really see a big push needed for renewables and the upside on solar, on wind, on geothermal. Staying on the electricity sector, globally, this is really one of the areas in which you're seeing a major transformation happening. Coal has been the mainstay of the global electricity sector in the past century. This is changing. We don't see coal increasing anymore. Coal capacity is not going to grow anymore. It's a combination of two trends. We are seeing increasing coal installation in Asia, some other parts of the world, but retirements in advanced economies. Gas is increasing very strongly. Several parts of the world, United States, Middle East, Asia. Why are we using gas? To mostly and more to balance flexibility of variable renewables. So in a very different way, we were using gas before. Nuclear, you see there a flat line. Does it mean that nothing is happening? Not at all. Again, you see some retirements happening in advanced economies and a lot of installation, especially in China, that is set to overtake the United States as largest place with the nuclear power capacity by the early 2030s. 2019, we are expecting to be the largest electricity generation seen yet on record, going higher than pre-Fukushima levels. Hydro, big growth story. China is currently building the second largest ever hydro power plant as we speak, but installations are also happening in Latin America and Africa and other places. Two main growth stories here: wind. More and more is offshore wind that is taking really an important share, especially in Europe. We have done an in-depth analysis. The potential for offshore wind is huge and is becoming increasingly cost competitive. So what we were seeing earlier was mostly an onshore wind story. Now is really a combination of the two, with Europe really seeing the lead here and followed by China. Overall, the major transformation is on solar PV. Solar PV last year already overtook nuclear in terms of installed capacity. Next couple of years, it will overtake wind, and then year after year, hydro, coal, gas, to become the first installed capacity in the planet. So some may pause here and think, job done. Actually, this is not the case. There are three key issues that we are highlighting for policymakers to work on, and we'll take them one by one. The first is going to be electricity security, meaning the implications that this huge increase of wind and solar variable renewables will have on the electricity system. The second is about legacy issues. Sometimes we just think that if we add solar and wind, we will have solved the problem. We have, in fact, a huge legacy, especially of coal, to tackle. And the third is about scale, and we'll come to that one by one. So we'll start with the electricity security. Now, it's kind of very obvious that today an interruption of electricity supply affects us all. We are now being transmitted live. If electricity goes off, because of the digital economy, the cost of an electricity supply disruption are increasing, and they will increase even more in the future. At the same time of this electricity becoming more central of our economies, we are seeing this huge transformation on the electricity supply. We are seeing more and more wind, which is variable, more and more solar, which is variable. So we analyzed in depth for all the electricity system in the world, what needs to happen to the rest of the system when you push in this solar and wind to adapt to this higher amount of solar and wind coming into the system, to analyze what happens to electricity security. And we started from last year, from 2018. Every hour, we analyzed what happens to natural gas, coal, etc., to accommodate these oscillations of wind and solar. So this is something that I think many of you will have witnessed yourself. 15th of July, final of the World Cup. All of us were certainly in front of television. Was evening, electricity demand spiked, sun was going down, there was no wind. It meant that all the rest of the system, solar, nuclear, coal, had to be ramped up, accelerate very strongly. How much did they have to accelerate? They had to go up 20%. 20%, if you want to imagine how much that is, imagine is that France is all switched off. There is no power generation happening in France. And within 1 hour, you need to go from 0 to 100. So you need to switch on in 1 hour all the power plants of France. Of course, we managed last year. We did it very nicely. It doesn't happen only in Europe. It happened in India. The same episode is not on football. They apparently are not big football fans. It's cricket. Similar thing. The system had to accommodate as well and ramp up. There are also episodes in which the system, natural gas and coal, they need to slow down very quickly. When does that happen? It happens when we have, for example, strong winds. Now is the season in Europe, around October, November, you see a lot of high winds in this part of Europe, which is an excellent thing because we are able to provide cheaper electricity. If we are able to accommodate this wind in the system, in that moment, that electricity is the cheapest we can all use. The other thing is, why do we put solar and wind is to avoid emissions. If we are not able to accommodate renewables, it means that we are actually failing to save CO2 emissions. Because we will need to use coal, we will need to use gas, therefore we would be avoiding some emissions reductions. So in that episode last year, November, high winds in Northern Europe, everything else had to slow down very quickly. How much? I give you a similar example. It is like taking all Germany capacity from 100% down in 1 hour. So all the hours of last year are plotted here. And I have to say, the systems managed pretty much everywhere all the time. We managed to supply electricity at times with good reliability. Move forward, fast forward to 2040. This is the plot, the same plot of what will happen to the electricity system, the ups and downs, the acceleration and deceleration. In short, the systems will need to have oscillations that are twice as large as today, to the minimum, in certain cases, such as India, is 4 times larger. So we need, one word, keyword, flexibility. Otherwise, we are not able to ensure electricity supply security. Are governments and investors putting the right things in place? We have some question marks. We are not seeing investment arriving quickly enough. Where? In networks, demand-side response, and especially one thing, battery storage. Battery storage costs are decreasing very quickly, is modular. It can provide the flexibility that those systems will need. So much more attention and focus will have to be put accompanying these big solar and wind installations. Flexibility and battery storage will be key. So the first item is flexibility. The second, legacy. So we are putting in solar and wind, and we may think that the job is done. We may think that emissions are going to be cut automatically. It's not the case. So we have today around 2,250 gigawatts of coal installed globally, of which 170 are being built as we speak in this very moment. Most of this is subcritical. Subcritical means that it's very low efficiency. So it emits more than a good plant, an efficient plant would. Large majority is in developing Asia, and if you ask what age is this, it's 12 years old. It's a young teenager that is going to be alive and kicking for many, many years to come. We're expecting these to stay around for around 40 to 50 years. This is the nameplate capacity that normally coal-fired power plants have. So today, coal emits the largest amount of emissions, 10 gigatons. If policies are not changed and you don't build anything new, coal-fired power plants will remain, despite the huge growth that we have seen of solar and wind, will remain the largest emitter in the planet. So we looked at this issue heads on, because if we don't solve this, emissions will not go down in line with the Paris Agreement, in line with international climate goals. Where would those plants need to go in terms of emissions? This is the CO2 trend that would be compatible with the Paris Agreement. It's a huge gap. So we have analyzed in each of the countries what would be the most economic way to make sure that those plants are compatible with Paris. There are 3 solutions that we analyzed. They vary country by country depending on the age, the rest of the economics, the rest of the systems, etc. But basically, there are 3 things that one can do. First, retrofitting with carbon capture and storage. When does it make economic sense? When the plant is young, very efficient, and you're close to a storage facility. We are seeing interest happening in the United States, in Canada, in the UK. So, so far, quite disappointing, but we have hopes that there is a renewed interest in this key technology. Repurposing. What does it mean, repurposing? Coal fleet can provide the flexibility we were mentioning earlier. So we could use those coal-fired power plants less and less to produce electricity, but to ensure that the lights are always on. This India is a huge country with a huge capacity, is actually looking into this very, very seriously. And finally, in some cases, early retirements. We have a few examples. Germany just put out 2038 full closure, but China has also done some early retirements with some 50 gigawatts of capacity being retired at around 20 years of age. So legacy is the second issue, flexibility, legacy, and the third one is the following, is about scale and speed of the transition. We looked at CO2 emissions. If you look at what happened since 2010, basically emissions were growing at an average 1% a year. If we don't enact more policies, this trend will continue to 2050. Very far cry away from where we will need to be. Of course, there are a lot of policies that countries are taking into account. The one that Tim Gould mentioned earlier, stated policy scenario, where we would go, we see somehow a better situation, but yet emissions are nearly flattening, but is not where we would need to be. Where would we need to be is this scenario. What is this scenario? This scenario is fully aligned with the Paris Agreement. It will require a peak in emission immediate and a very, very steep decline. This scenario takes into account all the net zero targets that countries have taken into account, the UK, France, Sweden, and many others, is incorporated here. So there are a few countries that actually reach zero much earlier for the globe to reach net zero a bit later. What do we need to push? We need to push efficiency. The executive director mentioned earlier, 2018, very disappointing, 1.2% improvement in efficiency. The potential for economic pushes in efficiency is 3%, and this is what you see there. Renewables, you've seen this tremendous growth in solar. We were getting to 3,000 gigawatts. To get here, we would need twice as much. We need 6,000 gigawatts. So it's a matter of scale, pushing more. But it's not enough. We will need to get onto fuel switch, hydrogen, CCUS, and others. If you look into the details, and this is what we have done, we've gone country by country. Each country is different, has different policy preferences, different investment environment, different resources. So what you need to push in any places is slightly different. So very clearly, there is no single or simple solution to reach the sustainable energy goals, including the Paris Agreement. You will need to push efficiency in cooling as you need to push offshore wind. You need to push CCUS in industry as you need to push hydrogen. This scenario is actually on track to achieve a 1.65 degree by 2100 without use of negative emissions. If you use negative emissions, which is something there is a lot of discussion about, this would bring temperature to 1.5 degrees. And with this, I will turn the floor to the executive director.
Thank you very much, Laura and Tim, for the excellent explanations about our report. Our report is, ladies and gentlemen, over 800 pages. We are just trying to give you some of the highlights from that. And if I can try to conclude with some messages from us, we think the energy policies around the world, Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, everywhere, they are trying to adjust to new pressures and new imperatives. But what we see, the response from the governments and industries far from being satisfactory to address our energy security and environmental challenges. When I say environmental challenges, both climate change, but at the same time, air pollution. We also see that the oil and gas landscape is changing very fast. The shale revolution, we are seeing a lot of impacts of shale on the prices, markets, impact on the traditional exporters. But we believe what we have seen up to now is only the start of those implications. We will see much stronger implications of the shale revolution on the oil and gas markets in the next years to come. We also see that the oil and gas industry around the world, especially in Europe and North America, is facing increasing demands to clarify the implications of energy transitions for their business models, for their strategies, and for their operations. And they are also asked to present how they are, oil and gas companies, are going to support, contribute to the clean energy transitions around the world. We are seeing that the solar, wind, including offshore wind, battery storage, they are going fast, but not fast enough that one would like to see. Therefore, it is important to see that the government support, public sector support is critical here. But our World Energy Outlook makes it very clear. Even if we build everything in the next 20 years for renewables, sustainable infrastructure, it is still extremely important to deal with the legacy issues that we have built in the last several decades, because they will be with us many, many years to come, and they are going to emit emissions. Therefore, we have two jobs: to build the new ones, sustainable, but second, also to tackle the problems associated with the existing energy infrastructure. Coal power plants, as Laura mentioned, but also factories, big cargos, refineries, and others. Africa. When we look at the Africa, and when I look at our report here, carried out by the World Energy Outlook team with several collaborators in different parts of Africa, and talking with several African ministers and leaders, I can tell you that I am optimistic about Africa's energy future. I am optimistic about Africa's energy future because of several reasons, at least three of them. Number one, very young population. Every second person between now and 2040 added to global population will come from Africa. 1 out of 2. A very young population. Second, the critical technologies such as solar, wind, they are now very, very cheap compared to 20 years ago. And it is abundant in Africa. And third, I see many governments now, very different than before, are taking the energy issues as a key priority. Let me give you two examples. Just there are good examples, but Kenya is one of them. Ghana is another one. Only 5-6 years ago, the access to electricity in those countries were about 20%, about those levels, and both of the countries are now, in 2-3 years of time, going to have access for everybody in their countries. Good leadership, right energy policies. So therefore, I believe, looking at all these factors, the pessimists will be surprised by the developments in Africa sometime soon. To finish, we believe that all stakeholders have a part to play to have a sustainable energy future, but the main responsibility lies with the governments, and it is their responsibility to write the wonderful chapter in the history of energy, unlike the one that Mr. Gould showed you a few minutes ago. So this is our message of today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. So we have time for a couple of rounds of questions. We usually take them by three, so if you would just please identify yourselves and the media you're with, and just don't forget to turn on your mics when you're asking a question. Question there, yeah.
Is that, yep. Jonathan Lopez from ICIS. We cover the petrochemicals industry, so reading the report, petrochemicals is due to be one of the sectors where crude oil demand grows the most. With all the circular economy initiatives coming from the EU, don't you expect some sort of biofuels to make up for that feedstock, so the petrochemicals industry can stop using crude oil as a feedstock? Another question goes very quick on the Strait of Hormuz. You mentioned on the report how vital that is for world oil supply. But if something was to happen there, actually, who would supply the world with crude oil? Would that be the US, or what could happen there? And just a very quick one, almost personally, I've been coming to this press conference for a few years. You keep encouraging policymakers to change things. Nothing seems to happen. How pessimistic or frustrated are you?
That was three questions from one person. I meant one question, three. Anyway, do you want to start with any other questions? Perhaps we can just run through the list. Yeah.
Christian Schubert from the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Germany. One question, actually it's quite a German question in a way. Have the recent announcements of the exit of coal, are they in the stated policy scenario? Okay, all right. And there is an issue there's in Germany about opening one new coal plant next year. I just wonder, in general, are you against opening new coal plants completely because they could replace old ones? How do you? What is your position on this? And if I add one, may add one more. You talked about, Madam Kotzi, about the flexibility to switch from one energy to another. Decentralized energy production, is that very important in that respect, or is that yeah? How do you see that? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Just we take this. Why don't Tim start with the petchem?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Indeed, you're right that petchem or demand for oil products as a petrochemical feedstock is one of the more robust elements in our projections for oil demand. You can see that in the stated policy scenario, where it's the single largest element in the growth or the segments that grow in oil, but it's also a segment that grows in the sustainable development scenario. And that's despite the increasing attention paid in many countries around the world to recycling. So in the sustainable development scenario, well, today around 15% of plastics are recycled, and there's a huge push to increase that as built into the sustainable development scenario. So by 2050 in that scenario, some 40% of the world's plastics are recycled. So that's a major difference in terms of comparison with what we have today. And that helps to reduce petchem demand by some 15%. But still, it still remains a big part of the non-combustion use of oil in the sustainable development scenario. You asked about bio-based feedstocks. There's certainly a lot of interest in that. There are issues of cost, but in the design of a deep decarbonization, it's not obvious that you prioritize the petchem sector as the destination for the limited sustainable bioenergy feedstock. In deep decarbonization scenarios, you tend to use that available feedstock in other uses that are emitting today. So, for instance, in aviation or in other hard-to-abate sectors. So you tend not to see that those bio-based feedstocks growing very strongly in most of the decarbonization scenarios out there.
Perhaps, Jet, I will ask Lara to talk about the coal and flexibility. I will come to the Hormuz and the frustration later on. So, Lara.
Thank you. So I would say that we are an all-fuel, all-technology organization, so we are not pro or against specific technologies, but there are emissions constraints. So as long as a country decides or a bloc decides to get to certain emission trajectories, then certain choices make more or less sense than others. In our stated policy scenario, we have included all of the 14 countries in Europe that have actually decided to phase out coal. We see Europe get on a very good trajectory in terms of emission reduction, but not in line to be carbon neutral by 2050. So more would need to be done, even in Europe, to reach the stated carbon neutrality or the hopeful carbon neutrality by 2050. I think on the point of flexibility is a combination of things. So depending on which areas of the world you are, the flexibility needs are, the driver of the flexibility needs are different. In some cases is additional wind and utility solar. In some other cases is decentralized solar. More and more we are seeing decentralized solution playing a role in the need for flexibility. What is needed to fix the flexibility issue is a combination of things. Grids, we see them as incredibly important to fix flexibility needs going forward for Europe, but elsewhere too. Conventional power plant, demand side response, very much untapped. And I said earlier, battery storage, we see it really as being critical and potentially supplying in the future a cheap form of flexibility.
So it's decentralized system is more flexible, or can one say it, or?
I'm not sure that one can say that the decentralized system is more flexible. So we will continue to see for many years to come a combination of traditional systems with grids that will be complemented over time with more parts of decentralized areas. We are not going to switch from one day to the next into something that is fully decentralized. So the two systems have to coexist and talk to each other.
If I may, on coal, I just want to say one thing in Germany and coal. There may be issues here, one coal mine here, one decision there, but I would say that when I look at the German government's position in terms of climate change, it is definitely one of the most determined and progressive climate policies. In Germany, you said their tone macht the music. So when you look at the general tone of the German government energy policy, it is definitely one of those who is pushing the climate change agenda in a strong way. Hormuz, yes, we are seeing several threats on Hormuz. We have seen some signs of risks, and when I look at the Middle East today, it will be not true if the risks around Hormuz is completely out of picture. What happens in case of an accident or an attack? Definitely there are many countries who will step in, but the International Energy Agency is there for those days. We have more than enough stocks to address this challenge for weeks and months to come. In terms of frustration, yes and no. It's a bit of like a French answer, but it's a yes and no, I would say. Because we see the emissions are still rising, but some governments are pushing it very strongly. We have seen two major government efforts changing the picture. One of them is Tim show you that as a result of the US government's effort, the shale gas, shale oil, is now part of the game. Technology became cheaper as a result of the R&D efforts, as a result of the tax credit and others. Second, solar PV. the huge, only a few years ago, it was very expensive, and now it is one of the cheapest source of electricity generation. We recently, within the World Energy, published our offshore wind. It's a tiny, very tiny source of electricity generation, only 0.3%. But the reason that I put so much efforts of the International Energy Agency on offshore wind, we expect similar level of cost reduction offshore wind, and offshore wind becoming the largest source of electricity generation in Europe, in a carbon neutral Europe within the next 2 decades. This is also mainly as a result of the government support and government efforts.
Thank you. I think we have, for Dr. Birol, just time for one more question. So,
Yeah, hi, Jeff Schaefer from Associated Press. I was curious, you were talking about governments and their role. Have you done analysis in this report on the United States and the 2017 withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord? Have you done analysis on what effect that has had over the last 2+ years overall, and the policies along those lines?
We see that the United States emissions have seen a major decline in the last decade or so, mainly driven by the natural gas replacing coal. Coal consumption is in a decline, and also the increase of renewable energies, solar, wind, others. When it comes to the U.S. government decision of withdrawing Paris Agreement, it's up to them to decide, every government to decide what they are going to do. For us, 2 things are important. One, the domestic policies and priorities, what they are doing in terms of reducing the emissions. And the second one is also important. It's a global issue. Therefore, it is important to have international concerted efforts to address the climate change.
okay. Unfortunately for Dr. Birol, that's all the time we will have. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any further questions, we're happy to take them as well to the press office or to Tim and Laura as well. Thank you. You can stay here.